The lecture hall was buzzing as students trickled in, clutching coffees, backpacks slung lazily over shoulders, the usual Monday morning weariness settling over the room like fog. Calculus 2 with Professor Aldridge was one of those classes people whispered about in hallways, a course that separated the merely smart from the mathematically elite. Aldridge had a reputation that traveled far beyond the campus of Westbridge University. Gruff, unapologetic, and intellectually intimidating, he prided himself on weeding out the weak, and had no patience for hesitation or error. Students who stumbled were often met with a theatrical sigh or a public dissection of their failure. Malik Johnson arrived 5 minutes early and slipped into a seat in the front row, surprising a few of the students already seated there. Most avoided sitting too close to Aldridge, preferring the anonymity of the middle rows. But Malik didn't seem to mind. He was quiet, dressed simply in a gray hoodie, jeans, and a pair of worn sneakers. He carried no flashy laptop, no high-end tablet, just a thick, beat-up notebook and a pen that had clearly seen better days. The professor entered right on schedule, his presence silencing the room like a flipped switch. He walked with a stiff spine and an air of impatience, his briefcase slapping against his thigh. Without so much as a greeting, he snapped open the latches and pulled out a folder of notes. "Let's begin," he said flatly. His eyes scanned the room like a radar, pausing when they landed on Malik in the front row. Something in his gaze changed, narrowed slightly, as if calculating a variable he didn't yet understand. He turned to the whiteboard and scribbled out an expression, lim x 0, sin x, x. Then he turned back around, marker still in hand. "You, there," he said sharply, pointing directly at Malik. "What's the limit of this expression?" A few students turned to look at Malik, some with sympathy, others with a hint of curiosity. The question was standard, almost too easy for the first day of class. But the tone Aldridge used suggested something else. It wasn't really a test of calculus. It was a test of confidence. Malik looked up, unfazed. "1," he said clearly. Aldridge gave a crooked smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "Lucky guess," he muttered, turning back to the board. He underlined the equation and added a quick note beneath it. "Let's try something a bit more stimulating, shall we?" He began scribbling furiously, lines of integrals and complex trigonometric identities unfolding in real time like a mathematical web. He didn't even stop to explain what he was writing. When he finally stepped back, the board held a monstrous integral, something so dense and convoluted it could make most undergrads dizzy. There was a pause. "Solve this," Aldridge said, gesturing to the board. "Now." Gasps and whispers fluttered across the room like startled birds. No one had expected this, especially not on the first day. Most professors might have asked students to introduce themselves, maybe review some prior knowledge. Aldridge had just thrown a live grenade. Malik closed his notebook slowly, rose from his seat, and walked toward the board with deliberate calm. His footsteps echoed slightly in the vast room. No backpack, no calculator, no peeking at notes. Just him and the problem. Aldridge leaned back against his desk, arms folded, a faint smirk curling at the corners of his mouth. To him, this wasn't about the math anymore. It was theater. He was establishing dominance, reinforcing the unwritten hierarchy between professor and student. But Malik didn't seem to notice, or care. He picked up the marker and studied the integral in silence. His head tilted slightly, like a musician, hearing a melody that others missed. The seconds stretched out. Some students looked away, not wanting to witness what they assumed would be a slow unraveling of a freshman's confidence. Then Malik began to write. The first step was clean and precise, a substitution method that eliminated one layer of complexity. Then he simplified a nested trigonometric expression, flawlessly, without hesitation. The math unfolded smoothly, like water finding its path downhill. Line by line, Malik dismantled the problem, reducing it piece by piece until the chaos became clarity. A murmur rose from the students. A few leaned forward. One guy in the back whispered, "Wait, he's actually doing it." Others watched with wide eyes, their morning drowsiness replaced by a growing sense of awe. Professor Aldridge straightened slightly. The smirk was gone. His eyes narrowed, not in skepticism this time, but in something closer to disbelief. Malik added the final step and drew a box around the answer, stepping back without drama. He capped the marker and handed it to the professor without a word. Aldridge took it, his fingers brushing Malik's for a brief second, then looked at the board as if seeing it for the first time. He read through the solution silently, then again. It was perfect, elegant, minimalist even, every step necessary, nothing wasted. He cleared his throat. "What's your name?" "Malik Johnson," came the soft reply. Aldridge nodded slowly but didn't say thank you, or good job. He simply turned back to his notes and resumed the lecture, but his voice had lost its swagger. Malik returned to his seat, opened his notebook again, and began taking notes like nothing unusual had happened. But the rest of the class couldn't. Stop stealing glances at him. Something had shifted in that room. An unspoken power dynamic had been disrupted, and Aldridge, for all his authority and tenure, had just been outclassed by a student he thought he could humiliate. For a moment, after Malik finished writing, the lecture hall was silent in a way that wasn't typical for a Monday morning. It was as if the energy had shifted, as if the usual hierarchy between professor and student had been suspended, even if only briefly. Students sat frozen, still gripping their pens mid-sentence, eyes bouncing between Malik and the board, and then to Professor Aldridge, who remained rooted behind his desk with an expression that hovered somewhere between confusion and disbelief. He blinked. Twice. The math was flawless. Even a cursory glance confirmed it. The substitution Malik used wasn't just clever, it was advanced, and the steps that followed weren't copied or regurgitated from a textbook. They showed deep, intuitive understanding. There was rhythm to Malik's work, like someone who didn't just know formulas but knew how to think in math. Aldridge adjusted his glasses, eyes scanning the board again. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Malik, now seated once more, didn't look up from his notebook. "I taught myself differential equations a few years ago," he said, almost offhandedly, as if he'd just mentioned learning how to ride a bike. "Started with online materials, then built some of my own tools to check my work." A few students turned in their chairs to look at him again, this time not with sympathy or curiosity, but with respect, or something close to it. It wasn't common to hear someone talk about teaching themselves differential equations, especially not someone so young, so unassuming, sitting there with a quiet confidence that didn't require attention. A voice from the back broke the silence. "Wait, you built tools? Like code?" Malik nodded, finally looking up. "Yeah, Python mostly. I made a symbolic integrator that handles some multivariable problems. A little rough, but it works." There was a low ripple of laughter, the kind that comes from genuine surprise and admiration, not mockery. Someone in the third row whispered, "Bro's a walking Wolfram Alpha." Aldridge shifted uncomfortably at the front. His role as the all-knowing figure in the room had just been challenged in a way he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't that he had never been corrected before. Plenty of students had caught small errors or challenged the phrasing of a theorem, but none had ever outperformed him publicly. And certainly not on the first day. Not someone like Malik. A student he had, if only subconsciously, expected very little from. "You said you taught yourself?" the professor asked again, his tone now softer, less adversarial. "Yeah," Malik replied. "Didn't have access to AP classes in high school, but I liked patterns. Math just made sense to me." He shrugged. "It's like learning a language, once you listen closely enough." A few heads nodded. Even those who didn't love math understood what he meant. Malik didn't say it to impress anyone. It was just how his brain worked. Another student spoke up. "Did you ever compete, like in Olympiads or math leagues?" Malik hesitated for a second. "I did one last year, National Math Olympiad. Placed in the top 5. But I didn't talk about it much." He smiled, just a little. "Didn't think it would matter here." Now the room was buzzing again, but this time with a very different tone. People started whispering things like, "How did I not know that?" and "This guy's a legit genius." There was no envy in it, just awe. Malik had walked into a hostile environment and diffused it not by arguing or posturing, but by letting his work speak for him. Aldridge didn't respond right away. He stood at the board, the marker still in his hand, though he no longer seemed to know what to do with it. Eventually, he cleared his throat and motioned awkwardly to the problem Malik had solved. "Well, you're clearly comfortable with advanced material," he said, the edge in his voice dulled. "We'll continue with some foundational concepts today, for the rest of the class." It was the closest thing to an admission the students had ever seen him make. Malik just nodded and kept taking notes. The rest of the lecture was subdued. Aldridge taught with his usual precision but without the usual performance. He didn't single out any other students. He didn't bark questions. He didn't pace dramatically across the front of the room. Something about the earlier exchange had taken the wind out of him. More importantly, the rest of the students were no longer watching him quite the same way. Their attention had quietly shifted. Every time Malik flipped a page, scribbled a note, or underlined a theorem, someone was watching, wondering what he saw that they didn't. After class, the usual routine of students rushing for the door was broken. A small group lingered near the front, and one by one, they approached Malik. "Yo, man, that was insane. What did you use for learning integrals like that? Do you have a GitHub or something? I want to see that tool you built. Were you seriously top 5 in the Olympiad? Why haven't we heard of you before?" Malik was polite, but not boastful. He answered questions, gave a few recommendations, mentioned some of his favorite resources. One student offered to get coffee sometime and talk about math modeling. Another asked if Malik tutored. A girl from the middle row asked him to look over one of her old problem sets, just to see how he thought through it. What had started as a tense classroom power play had turned into an impromptu math meetup, with Malik at the center, not because he demanded attention, but because his talent was magnetic. In the background, Professor Aldridge watched, expression unreadable. He was still at his desk, sorting his papers, but his eyes drifted to the small crowd around Malik more than once. There was a flicker of something behind his gaze. Was it regret? Curiosity? Or maybe the slow realization that he had underestimated someone he couldn't afford to? He didn't say another word to Malik that day, but he didn't need to. The message had been sent, loud and clear. By the time the third week of class rolled around, Malik Johnson was no longer just a quiet student in the front row. He had become something of a legend, not in the viral, exaggerated way students sometimes talked about campus characters, but in the more grounded, respectful kind of way that comes from witnessing real, undeniable brilliance. His name carried weight now, not because he asked for it, but because no one could stop talking about what they'd seen. The moment he solved that monstrous integral on the first day still came up during lunch breaks and late-night study sessions. It had turned into a story. Were you there when Malik schooled Aldridge? That people shared with growing enthusiasm, each retelling slightly more dramatic than the last. And yet, the heart of the story remained true. A student had stepped into a hostile classroom, been challenged in front of everyone, and had completely dismantled the professor's expectations, not with arrogance, but with quiet mastery. Malik, for his part, remained unchanged. He still arrived early, still sat in the same seat, and still wore the same worn hoodie and sneakers. He took notes with the same steady hand, barely reacting when Aldridge called on him, which, interestingly, happened far less often now. If the professor had originally tried to make Malik a target, he now seemed unsure of how to engage with him at all. The balance had shifted, and Aldridge was treading carefully, but that didn't mean he ignored Malik completely. On the contrary, there was a subtle deference in the way Aldridge conducted himself around him now. When complex topics came up, multidimensional analysis, advanced integral techniques, vector calculus, the professor would occasionally glance toward Malik, almost seeking silent confirmation before diving in. It wasn't overt, but it was obvious to anyone paying attention. Aldridge, the same man who once thrived on intimidating students into submission, now hesitated in the presence of one. That change didn't go unnoticed. Students whispered about it after class, laughing softly at the irony. "He looks at Malik like he's grading him," one said with a chuckle. Another responded, "Honestly, he probably should be." It didn't take long for news of Malik's talents to spread beyond the walls of that one lecture hall. Professors from other departments, computer science, engineering, even philosophy, started showing up during Aldridge's lectures, lingering in the back as if just passing through, though everyone knew why they were really there. Malik was becoming a campus-wide curiosity, a quiet genius who didn't flex, didn't show off, and didn't need to. His work did the talking. One afternoon, a mass email went out from the math department titled, "Student Spotlight, Malik Johnson." It contained a short write-up of his academic background, which was even more impressive than most students had realized. Not only had he placed in the top 5 of the National Math Olympiad, but he had also been a finalist in the International Youth Logic Games and had presented a paper, a real paper, at a math education conference during his senior year of high school. The email included a photo of Malik, standing in front of a whiteboard filled with dense equations, grinning sheepishly like he wasn't quite sure what all the fuss was about. Beneath the image, a paragraph described his work on developing accessible math tools for underfunded schools, specifically programs that allowed students to explore calculus concepts without needing expensive graphing calculators or software. That was the moment everything changed. Within days, faculty members were inviting Malik to join honor societies, research groups, and student leadership panels. He politely declined most of them, not out of arrogance, but because he had no interest in posturing. He wanted to build things, help others understand the language he loved, and avoid wasting time on anything that felt performative. But there was one offer he did accept. The department chair approached Malik privately after class one day. Unlike Aldridge, who still carried the stiff armor of academic pride, the chair had a warmth to him. He listened, He asked real questions, and most importantly, he didn't talk down to Malik. He spoke to him like an equal. They sat in his office for nearly an hour, discussing not just Malik's ideas, but his frustrations with how math was taught, the barriers he saw for students who looked like him, and how much talent was lost every year simply because it wasn't recognized early enough. When the chair asked Malik if he'd consider helping lead a new peer tutoring initiative, he hesitated at first. "I'm not really a tutor," Malik said. "I'm just someone who loves the subject." "That's exactly who students need," the chair replied. So he agreed. A few days later, flyers went up around campus. Calculus workshop with Malik. Johnson, learn from a National Math Olympiad finalist. The first session was packed. Students from all backgrounds filled the room, notebooks ready, some curious, others desperate for help. Malik didn't lecture, he talked to them, asked what they struggled with, broke things down in plain language, used metaphors that made everyone laugh, like comparing the chain rule to a factory assembly line or explaining vector fields with subway maps. By the end of that first hour, more than a few students who had considered dropping the course decided to stick with it. They finally felt like they could understand this stuff. Malik had taken the fear out of it. That, more than anything, was his true power, not just solving problems, but showing others that they could too. As for Aldridge, he remained a fixture in the lecture hall, still as sharp as ever, still clinging to his authority. But something fundamental had changed. He no longer ruled the room. He no longer wielded fear like a tool. His lectures were quieter now. More precise, less condescending. He even began incorporating some of Malik's analogies, subtly, without credit, but clearly inspired. Once, during a particularly complex lecture, he paused mid-explanation and looked toward Malik. "Anything to add?" he asked. Malik raised his head from his notebook. "No," he said with a small smile. "You're doing fine." It was the first time the class had ever seen Aldridge smile back. Malik never sought to humiliate anyone. He didn't need to. His presence, his work, his calm assurance, that was enough. And slowly, over the weeks, even Aldridge seemed to understand. The real measure of genius isn't in crushing others. It's in lifting the bar so high that others begin to rise toward it.